In this presentation, we'll talk about modern times and Italian times. So the development of a new timing of reality, which coincides with the advent of industrial modernity, and also the development of an Italian model of timing of reality, which tries to combine and synthesize the eternal, immobile element of recurring time with an accelerated notion of times as a plurality, which is kind of the idea of modern time, the modern timing of reality. So we'll discuss about the process of measuring time and how modernity changes the way men related to time. We'll see how this change in the creation of modern time will be absorbed by culture and how this modern time will be perceived and narrated. And lastly, we'll discuss about Italy's way to modernity as a hybrid fusion of eternity and plurality of times and acceleration of times. Now, we were saying that time has always been measured by man, and the measurement of time was a way in which humans would relate to the cosmos, not only in the Temple of Stonehenge, which was an astronomical clock, but also in the idea of counting the years out of the revolution of the Earth around the Sun, of months depending on the revolution of the moon around the Earth, and days as a way to measure the revolution of the Earth around itself. So time has always been associated with man's relationship with the cosmos, and clocks have always had a relationship with astronomy. A lot of clocks indicated the hours, but also were astronomical clocks, so the position of planets in the cosmos. So time was a way to assess man's position in the cosmos, but also a way to measure man's temporal nature in history. So the calendar and the progression of the creation of calendar is a way in which humans try to make sense of their own time in history. So starting from the 10-month calendar of Romulus of 304 days, and this is the reason why we have like Sept, Oct, Nov, and December, 7, 8, 9, and 10th month. Starting from Romulus, we have like an update with in the Age of Kings, in the early Roman Age of Kings, with Numa Pompilius, who moved the calendar to 12 months, equaling like 355 days. So he added Januarius, so January, and Februarius, February. And he also added a Mercedonius day to kind of period to recover the lost time every year. Julius Caesar was really the one who developed the calendar, the so-called Julian calendar, in 12 months and 365 days that we know. He added Quintilis as a 5th month, and so he turned Quintilis into Julius, and the Sextilis, so the 6th month, into Augustus, so August. And he also introduced the idea of leap years to recover kind of the missed 6 hours that are missed every year. Now, within this context, you have to fast forward like a few centuries to the 16th century, when Gregory XIII, the Pope, basically obeys to a new calculation done by Copernicus, which implied that every 128 years, a day would be lost, according to the calculation of the solar year. So the Pope had to really cancel 10 days out of the calendar. So the days between October 4th and October 15th, 1582 never existed, to really amend this mistake and reposition human timing around the correct solar year. Also, in addition to this, time was also measured in connection to movement. The movement generates the calculation of hours. So the movement of sand in the hourglass, the movement of water, so there were like water clocks, and the movement of the sun. So this was the idea of the Meridian, which was calculating the hour upon the shade that the sun was reflecting on this mural clock. Now, the calculation of the hours is also an issue in the old way of measuring time, because hours were normally calculated starting from the sunset. So and they were calculated counterclockwise. So hour 1 in the so-called Ora Italica. This is a clock painted by Paolo Uccello in the Cathedral of Florence in the 15th century. So the first hour was the first hour after sunset, and the length of hours, 24 hours per day, depended on the length of light. So they might be 60 minutes or 80 or 40 minutes depending on the length of the day. So it varied depending on the seasons. Now the Italian model of 24 hours was also had a counterpart in France with the model of the 12 hours repeated twice over the day. And this is also visible, for example, in the Italian calculation of the 24 hours and the Anglo-Saxon calculation of the 12 hours AM and the 12 hours PM. So this was like a debate between the Italic hour and the French hour that prolonged way into the 19th century. Now, solar time, which was the base of this calculation of man's relationship with his temporal nature, slowly went into crisis. The crisis starts from afar and really breaks out in the late 19th century. The real moment of crisis where we can begin this crisis of the solar time is the establishment in 1675 of the Greenwich Observatory. This was really a reference point in nautical charts, and the observatory was a way to establish an orientation for all the sailors who were traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. And we will see that Greenwich and its foundation will be a key factor in the development of world standard time. Now, there's also another element that puts the solar timing into crisis, which is the publication in 1687 of Newton's Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, a book where he basically assesses and documents with calculations that the Earth is not a perfect sphere. So the Earth is a spheroid flattened at the poles, and on this spheroid, the light that is shed by the sun cannot generate equal days on all the spots of the Earth. So there are points where the day's length is different than the established 24 hours. Actually, the solar day is not exactly 24 hours, and this explains the adjustments in the calendars that we discussed earlier. Now, in 1735, based on the reference point of Greenwich, Harrison, an English sailor engineer, devises like a new tool which is called the chronometer, which is a tool useful to locate the ship's position in the ocean. So by way of the difference between the meridian of the actual position where the ship was and the clock that was set on the Greenwich meridian. So by calculating the difference in hour, depending on the solar meridian, sailors could establish their position in the ocean. Now, the first idea of a wired time happens in 1851. It's the so-called Harvard Telegraph Times or wired time. So beats that are wired from the Harvard Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this idea of the Harvard Telegraph Time was presented at the first Universal Exposition of 1851 in London. And the development of transportation will also lead to the development of a notion of time that is no longer fixed to the one only time of each site's meridian, but on the notion of different times, of different timings, different meridians that are not often coinciding. So this is the reason why in 1870 Charles Dowd presented a pamphlet in the United States regarding the system of national time for railroads. So if railroads schedules were based upon meridian times, these times were often in conflict with each other, and this caused accidents and crashes. So Dowd proposed the idea of dividing the United States in 4 time zones. So this is the first idea of establishing a fictional time, no longer based on each city's meridian, but on a zone. So just to make an example, if you're in Boston and it's 8 a.m., it's also 8 a.m. in Pittsburgh, but the actual solar time in Boston and Pittsburgh might vary consistently. So the time zone is an artificial time set to equalize the solar meridians. This debate on railroads led to the formation and the organization of several geodetic and meridian conferences. So conferences that were establishing the need for a universal meridian, but also at the same time were measuring the Earth in its measurements, in its distances, in its heights. So geodesy means really the measurement of the Earth. There are 3 conferences that are particularly relevant and that precede the 1884 Meridian Conference of Washington, D.C., where the World Standard Time is created and approved. And these conferences take place in Paris and simultaneously in Rome in 1875. This is the conference that establishes a unit of measurement of time, which is the meter, and the conference that approves the decimal system. Which is a geometrical analytical system which replaces the system, for example, used in the United States that relates the body to space, so feet and inches as a way to relate the body to the measurement of space. Now, in this conference, there is an agreement which allows the French to hold the original copy of the meter, which is still in Paris, so to own the criterion for the measurement of space. This will be important because in 1884, Great Britain will use this as a trigger, as a leverage to actually acquire the criterion for the measurement of time. Now, the second conference that is particularly interesting happens in Venice in 1881, and this conference is about the need to establish a 0 point for the measurement of heights. And this is a conference that aims at verifying the level of the sea and establish a reference point for it. In 1883, and this gives you a sense of how Italy was involved in these international debates, there is a conference in Rome that takes place in October where several scientists from all over the world actually propose a universal day, a notion of universal day based on the Greenwich Meridian. So this conference will lead to the scientific approval of the Universal Day, but not to the political one. And this will be the case for the Washington Meridian Conference of 1884, the International Meridian Conference, where nations actually arrived to a political compromise accepting and establishing the universal day. So the political compromise is related to the choice of London. We discussed about it earlier, but London becomes the origin of modern time, mainly because of its pre-existing observatory, which was already a point of reference for the nautical charts. And London becomes the origin of time because of its industrial power and international prestige. So there's a shift here. Normally, the origin of time was related to metaphysics, to God, to an a priori category, to the immobile engine, if you want, in Aristotle. But at this point, it is established that there is an immanent principle that really gives origin to time. This is an important metaphysical question that is reduced to a political and mathematical calculation. The scientific conference also established an algorithm that made it possible to adjust the length of days equally on all the spots of the Earth to solve the issue that was raised by Newton. Now, in this conference, there were many proposals. Italy actually proposed Jerusalem as the origin of time, and France actually rejected the solution of London and continued to utilize Paris time as opposed to the global time of Greenwich. Italy will adapt to the meridian, will adapt the meridian of Rome to the Central European time, so the time zone of Central Europe in 1893. So 9 years after the Washington Conference. And France will actually conserve its Parisian time until 1911. And Poincaré was involved in the creation of this new French time, which was wired from the Eiffel Tower. Now, within this context, there's also another process that takes place in the late 19th century, which is the process of progressive miniaturization and privatization of timekeeping. So, timekeeping was based on the notion of a mechanical automatism. So one of the first mechanical clocks was on the bell tower of the Church of Sant'Eustogio in Milan of 1309, and the mechanism, which was very cumbersome, undergoes over the centuries a process of miniaturization from the Baroque clocks and table clocks, the pendulum and the table clock. Italians were really masters in this art, to the progressive miniaturization of the mechanism for pocket watches, especially those that were worn by men, whereas wristwatches were considered feminine items. So they had a very separate and parallel narration. Now, wristwatches emerge in the context of this debate over timekeeping and the origins of time. And the first object is the Patek Philippe wristwatch was the Patek Philippe of 1868, which was a feminine item, a jewel, a timekeeper embedded in a jewel. But over time, wristwatches started to prevail over pocket watches, especially after the certification that, for example, of the Omega watch of 1900, that wristwatches could be as precise and as reliable as pocket watches. Now, the success of wristwatches was also related to sports. So Cartier, the producer of watches, the jeweler, actually designed a wristwatch for Santos Dumont, a Brazilian pilot, aviator, who in 1904 completed the record of height in flight right after the first flight of the Wright brothers. And in order to hold the handlebar of the airplane, he could not detach his hands, and therefore the solution was the idea of a wristwatch that made it possible also to popularize this feminine item and make it appealing also to a male audience. Also, wristwatches started to be equated to a general universal time or universal language in connection with the brand Movado, which is an Esperanto word. Esperanto was like a universal language, and a tempo universal language started in 1887 that never really took off, but was a similar attempt to create a common coin for language, in the same way as there was an attempt to create a common coin for space, common measurement of time, sort of a universalism. And Movado, which meant movement in Esperanto, launched the Polyplan in 1912, which was really the most successful model of wristwatch for a male audience. Now, the success of wristwatches for a male audience was also ratified by World War I, where trench watches, which served the purpose of, once again, using two arms during the combat, was popularized in all the armies. And when soldiers were coming home, they actually preferred to continue having wristwatches. So this is how the wristwatch moved from being a jewel, a feminine jewel, to being a symbol of masculine precision, fight, and ability in sports. Now, these processes undergo a cultural negotiation. They are narrated. In modern time, the advent of this new privatized timekeeping and of this new universal timing undergoes a lot of cultural reflection. So this has philosophical implications. The implications of the diffusion of world standard time and of the mass diffusion of wristwatches. First implication is that modern time, as we're saying, is no longer transcendent, but rather immanent. The origin of time is no longer based on the sun and the heavens, as we saw in the beginning, or a philosophical category, on a priori, or God himself, but rather on a mathematical algorithm and the political power of London. Also, modern time, if you think about it, is really a fiction, because universal time actually is parallel to local time. As we were saying, the time of Boston and the time of Pittsburgh are different in their local meridian time, solar time, but they're actually equalized in this fictional time zone or universal timing that makes them equal. So world standard time is parallel and equivalent to solar and meridian time, and there is a notion of a dual temporality of reality, and also the notion that temporality can be manipulated. So if you think about it, every time zone is a sort of a manipulation or correction of time in order to make an equivalent time for different cities that are in the same zone. This manipulation of time will also be confirmed in 1916 with the first introduction of daylight savings. So the actual idea of moving time back and forth for the sake of economic savings. So this was invented in the UK as a way to guarantee an extra hour of production during World War I for the British Army. Now, the mass diffusion of wristwatches marks the passage from public to private time. So from the public time on the tower, on the bell tower, so owned by God, or the public time on the public building of the city, which associate time with time where time is owned by the state or the city. We move from this to a private time that we own. It's on our wrist, and it's a personal possession that we can manipulate and control at any point. And also time becomes a jewel, or rather cosmos. The word cosmos in Greek means jewel, so a bracelet, which the wristwatch is. But in Greek, the word cosmos means also cosmos, order and universe. It also has to do with cosmetics, so the idea of like beautifying. So a jewel where a new cosmos is contained, or rather a new universal order is contained. No longer the universal order of the heavens, but the new universal order established by the needs of industrialism. So trains and transportation and political power. Now, the construction of modern times really follows the impact of industrialization and the idea that industrialization carries of quantifying time on money. So the equation of time equals money starts with the need of industries to fix a rate that is equivalent to an amount of work done in a certain time. Also, the construction of modern times follows like a debate, which is both philosophical and scientific, on its nature, on its new nature. If this time is a fiction, then what is time or times? In this debate, a few voices enter, and in particular, the voice of Einstein is opposed to the voice of a French philosopher, Bergson. So Einstein has an idea of time as chronos, so as a quantitative time, as a division, kind of a millimetrical, to the smallest part of time into seconds and instants, and also time in agreement with the relativity theory is relative to other times. So we have the notion that our time is no longer one, but is multiple and plural. This is the reason why we talk about modern times, and Times is also the title of many newspapers that are founded in this period. Now, in opposition to Einstein, Bergson instead thinks of time in qualitative terms. So if he thinks of it not as chronos, so a mechanical division of instants, for example, of an hour, but rather as a kairos, that is, as an opportune time of revelation. He's saying that in an hour or in a day, not all instants are equal. There are some instants that really carry the meaning. For example, the instant when a person says, I love you, is much longer in our conscience and our awareness than its mechanical instant when this happened, which is equal to all the other instants contained in an hour. So time as kairos implies the idea of time as durée or duration. There are some instances that have a duration in our interior life. Within this context, it's also important to see the idea of William James of time as a flux or a stream of events. This will translate into literature, into the technique of the stream of consciousness. So this constant state of change and metamorphosis and stream of events that characterize our life. There are also political implications of time, which basically relate the calculation of time to political power. So Greenwich is an attempt to link time to politics, but also the idea of the calendar revolutions. So the idea of relating the calculation of time and the measurement of time around certain events that are breaking events, like the French Revolution, which really started a new calendar. And the case that is closer to our period is actually in 1922, the Fascist Revolution, which starts to calculate time from the march on Rome by the fascists, so the beginning of the regime. So if you happen to go to Italy, there are still some buildings that are dated with the EF, Era Fascista, plus the Roman number calendar. So EF9 building was a building built in 1931, so the 9th year of the fascist era. So time is related to political events. the cultural repercussions of these debates happen in Italy, especially in painting, are visible in painting, but also in contemporary literature. We see, for example, in the reemergence of the theme of the Baroque theme of the Dance of the Hour, for example, in Ponchielli's opera. The Dance of the Hour by Ponchielli has been staged in Fantasia by Walt Disney, but the theme of the Dance of the Hours also reappears in Gaetano Previati's painting of 1899, portraying muses running in this accelerated time of modernity that runs faster and faster and needs to be measured more and more precisely. Also, painting starts to represent this dual or double temporality, universal versus local time, by staging a notion of a wrong or outmoded sun that produces days of unequal length, and produces time that is no longer reliable for the needs of industrialization, is no longer as precise as needed. Now, I want to show you a couple of paintings by Segantini to prove this. The first is L'Ora dell'Ave Maria. It's actually two paintings with the same thing of 1882 and 1886, so right before and right after the conferences of Rome and Washington. This is a painting that really stages the Ora Italica, the Italic hour, where the two peasants that are coming home from work actually listen to the tower bell suggesting to pray the last Hail Mary, so the hour of the Hail Mary, that will start the new day. So the new day starts with the sunset. This was still present in rural areas of Italy until the late 19th century. Also in Pascoli, there is the poet, there are like references to the Ora Italica. The same Segantini, however, in 1891 would portray this striking gap between the Meridian time and the universal time in a painting called Noon in the Alps, where we see a woman, a shepherd in the context of the Alps, in the day, in the noon of the day, but where this noon is actually different from the noon that the shade indicates. So we have a declared noon, but also a solar noon that is making visible a temporal discrepancy. Also, we see how the sun is outmoded in later paintings by Severini, for example, in the Sunset on Porta Pinciana of 1903, where electricity, so a street lamp, which is really the protagonist of this painting, is outlasting the light of the sun. So days are no longer related to the solar light, but with the advent of the age of electricity are much longer. And in this sense, it does no longer make sense to calculate the day around light, sunlight, so the model of the Italic hour, but rather to calculate the days around the new needs of a division of time produced, radical division of time produced by industrialization. Also, in futurism, in Mercury Passes the Sun by Borla, we have the idea of a new timing, which is represented by Mercury, which is quicker than the slow time of solar time. This new time that appears on the global stage, but also in Italy, produces a double reaction of excitement and gloom, which is the reaction toward fashion, excitement of fashion, but also the death of fashion. This is basically the theme produced in Baroque painting. This is an example by Giovanni Garzoni, The Still Life with Clock and Skull, of the excitement of modern times, but also its outmoding, rapid outmoding, where it's rapid vanification symbolized by the skull and death. This idea of the skull and the clock, in connection with the clock, with the acceleration and vanishing of things, is actually an idea behind a very important scene in Gabriella De Nunzio's novel Il piacere, Pleasure, of 1889. It's one of the most important novels of the time, where in a scene of an auction, the protagonist, Perelli, tries to attract the attention of a woman, Elena, by touching a clock shaped like a skull, indicating in the clock that was touched by Elena the revitalization of Eros, or the excitement for this new time, but also in the form of a skull, the perception that this new time, this new excitement will vanish soon. The idea of modern timing as a time of excitement and danger is also staged in a novel of 1884 by Matilda Serao, entitled Chechina's Virtue. The model was published actually in installments in the late months of 1883. It was parallel to the conference, the Geodetic Conference of Rome, that we discussed. And in the novel, Serao stages the dialogue of Chechina, a frustrated wife of a doctor in Rome, who discusses with a friend, Isolina, who is an expert in love affairs, extramarital love affairs. And Isolina actually is saying to Chechina that she should commit adultery, but she would need, for these affairs, which would kind of rejuvenate her life, she would need a wristwatch. And we see that wristwatches are the wristwatch is presented as a tool for a new excitement, but for an illegitimate excitement. So this new time is perceived as something that produces a thrill, but also the danger, perceived danger, something to resist on. Now, in the dialogue between Isolina and Chechina, Isolina says at a certain point, you can't believe how terrible it is not to have a watch when you have a lover. You are always on the wrong time. You are too early, he is not there, and it's a slow death. You're late, a quarter of an hour has already passed, and for another quarter of an hour he pouts. Men are annoyed by waiting. If once at his place you asked him every 5 minutes, what time is it? This question will irritate him. You're always late on your return home, with such a bewildered look that it is a miracle that it doesn't betray you. My God, what would I do to have a watch? So this indicates this sense of need to follow this industrial modernization of a country like Italy, but also this perceived industrialization as danger or something illicit that breaks a normal order of time. And later on, during Futurism, watches are surrounded by a narration of celebration, which will be, once again, opposed to a narration of scare. But in Marinetti's, in Carrà's portrait of Marinetti, the founder of Futurism, we see that the writer is not just smoking, the symbol of kind of the rapidity of consumption, the fire that becomes ashes right away, but he is also represented with a wristwatch. So he is writing with his wristwatch, so calculating and being on track with this new accelerated time. And the wristwatch will also be a key symbol in a few Words in Freedom by Marinetti, so in the pursuit of the record, so the transoceanic crossing of different means of transportation from England to Labrador, but also in the tumultuous assembly of 1918, where we see an assembly related to World War I, where people are exchanging opinions, and we see on the upper right hand the flying of time from 245 to 305. So this is kind of the length that is measured of this assembly. At the same time, there is also a scare of this new quantified industrial time that measures records and measures the time for each action. And this is really quite visible in the parody by Piero Jaillet in the book on the life of Gino Bianchi, kind of the portrayal of a life of an Italian administrative man. And we see this idea of time that controls and measures not just the temporality, but also the life itself of man. And as we say, like Monday, 8 a.m., he wakes up, Gino Bianchi. 8:30 a.m., walks in the office door. 9 a.m., defecates, even on Sundays. 9:30 a.m., reads the newspaper in his office. 10:15 a.m., talks to his boss. 11 a.m., processes files. 11:45 a.m., dusts himself off, smooths his clothing, urinates. 2:20 p.m., walks in the office door. 4:30 p.m., absolute silence, regular breathing, unknown occupation. 5 p.m., processes files. 5:45 p.m., dusts himself off, smooths his clothing, urinates. So regular activities that are scheduled, on schedule. 7 p.m., checks out the downtown, makes an inventory of shop windows, approximately calculates the sexual heat of the women he meets on the street. So this quantification of time is a quantification of experience itself. 8 p.m., dines. 9 p.m., lies on his bed. On Sunday, the entry fulfill his marital duties is added. So even experience and the most intimate experiences are undergoing the new scheduling of this quantified time. In still life painting, so 1919 by Morandi, and the still life with clock is really a protest against this time, where we see on the right hand a clock which is turned around and we don't even see the hours. So it's an attempt to revert this acceleration of hours and return to a more human time, which contains a notion of something that stays. Because the element of acceleration of time and this constant emphasis on change and fashion brings forth, in a context like Italy, which is characterized by a lot of immobile ruins from the past, the question, kind of a repeated question, an underlying question on what remains, because like of all this change, what remains? Now, Italy also produces times in industry, and there are two different models. There is one model which tries to anchor time to timelessness. It's a model of Bulgari that anchors this acceleration, this speed, this movement of time to the eternity of a jewel. So Bulgari was a jewelry shop, but also to the eternity of the city of Rome. Near the Spanish Steps, so the eternity of art and aesthetics. There's another model, which is the model of Borletti, which is the first Italian factory company of watches after the success of the Italian orologeria watchmaking until the 17th century, which then was replaced by centers like London and Zurich in the 18th century, and later in the 19th by German and American watchmakers. So Borletti Pezzi is the first Italian company after a few centuries, and it produced like alarm clocks for the administrative man. And Borletti actually asked Da Nunzio to name the brand of alarm clocks. They were named Veglia, so vigil, playing with the word sveglia, alarm clock. And the image that Borletti chose for his company was once again an attempt to synthesize the modern movement of times with a notion of eternity, kind of in a similar but different way than Bulgari. Bulgari went the elitist way, fashion, jewelry. Borletti went kind of the mass scale way, so the production of serialized watches. And they both share this idea of putting together modern times. So in this case, instead of the disc in the allusion to the disc thrower statue, ancient disc thrower Greek statue. So instead of the disc, we have the alarm clock. But the alarm clock and the representation of the factory, so contemporariness, are related to a notion of everlastingness in the classical statue. This idea of overlapping eternity and contingence is part of the language of still life painting, but also part of the elaboration of a new idea of Italian modern times. So modern times that could keep into account an Italian element, so an element of eternity. And I think the most interesting synthesis of this process of elaboration is De Chirico's Enigma of the Hour of 1911. So painting produced in the 50th anniversary of the unification of Italy, a year of celebration that stages really a metaphysical space of Italy, and asks a question on what is really modern time in Italy. And we can observe this by tracing the hours on at the center of the painting. So it's 2:55, and as we can see, this hour 2:55 of the clock is very different from the solar hour that the shades indicate. It's much later in the afternoon. But this hour of 2:55 is placed on a train station. So it indicates the time of progress. It's the time of acceleration, a time of movement, which reflects a notion of a history or philosophy based on history, on the present history, or we can say material historicism, and reflects the phenomenon of the industrial acceleration and urbanization of Italy, its modernization, and its emphasis on fashion, constant movement, constant change, constant production. However, the same time, 2:55, is actually a stilled hour. So the contingent hour of the train station is actually placed in a painting in a frozen context, so it becomes an eternally stilled hour. So it indicates a time of immobility and stillness, reflecting this emphasis on an eternal deposit that Italy is endowed with, and in Hegelian spirit, the primacy of an eternal Italian spirit, and also a reference to religion and metaphysics as the realm of eternity, of a time that remains, of something that remains, like the Italian heritage. Now, this idea of the clock, of a stilled clock, against the context of industrial or moving sceneries, is recurring in De Chirico, as we can see in the paintings, The Delights of the Poet, The Philosopher Conquest, and Melancholy of Departure, where the clock is always related to trains, to a piazza, and to the trains in both paintings. To go back to the Enigma of the Hour, this image of a station, so acceleration, but with a classical tone in the arcs of the portico, which are reminders of arcs and columns of the Roman architecture. So this will also be an inspiration for fascist architecture later on. But this overlapping of present and eternity is also something that will happen in a political and philosophical form, especially in philosophy, through the figure of Giovanni Gentilly, who will become the ideologue of the fascist regime and also the Minister of Education from 1922 to 1924. He will do the reform of the school. But Giovanni Gentilly was a philosopher of the so-called actualism. So the actualism is a philosophy that attempts to provide a synthesis of Marxist historicism and Catholic heritage or Catholic metaphysics. So the idea of combining into a density of the instant, of the actual instant, reflection on the present, on a present that develops and is in constant change, so chronos if we want, but also a present that reveals an immobile eternity or immobile spirit. So this philosophy will become the pedagogy of fascism. Gentile would write treatise of pedagogy as a way to promote this synthesis and this idea of synthesizing the classics with, or the classical heritage and the Christian heritage with the dynamism of modernization. So the synthesis of his pedagogy and philosophy will have an application in fascism as a form of secular religion, as the oxymoron of secular religion, or as an immanent synthesis in fascism of ancient Rome, so eternity, and modernity, so industrialization and change. This will also find representation in fascist architecture, which is a reinvention, a modern reinvention of ancient themes and ancient modules of construction like arcs and columns. Fascism, as we said, will characterize itself as a new timing of reality, but also as an alternative timing of reality. And here is where we talk about the oxymoron of Italian times that are not just based on constant change as in other industrial nations, but they are grounding this change in an eternal spirit or value or heritage.